Today we're going to talk about how to manage your marketing content in an online setting. So let's start probably stating the obvious. Content marketing is absolutely essential online because at the end of the day, the customer has so many choices for their entertainment, for the products and services that they use, that unless they want to engage with you as a company, they are just not going to be there. They're not going to be in your channels. They're not going to be in your platforms. They are just basically choose somebody else. So because you want to make sure that your customer is choosing you, it's interested in what you're doing online. The content that you deliver to your customers or potential customers is the most essential aspect, probably, of your online presence. So this is why you probably will hear oftentimes, especially in the last 10 years, that content is king. Okay. Now, let's backtrack for a second back to our branding strategy that we covered maybe in our Principles of Marketing class. At the end of the day, as a brand, what you're trying to do is you're trying to delineate a unique personality, the unique core values that your brand stands for in the marketplace. What are you about, right? And the way you usually achieve this positioning is by comparing your brand in the marketplace to some of your competitors. So you can see here in the diagram, I have a picture, a representation. In this case, I don't think it's based on real data, honestly, of car brands, right? And what we're trying to capture here is the fact that different brands have a very different perception in the minds of the consumers. Now, the way we build these brand personalities, these brand associations, it's by delivering product and experiences that are in accordance to the image that we're trying to achieve, right? So if we're trying to portray a high quality product, right? It better be that when you get in our car and you touch the different materials in your surrounding, they actually feel upscale, right? It's not just about telling a story. It's not about telling customers that your brand is high quality. It's actually delivering the goods, right? And yes, I understand quality can have different connotations for different customers. We're not going to get too deep into the woods when it comes down to this. But at the end of the day, it's not only about delivering the goods, it's also about telling the story, right? So this is where content marketing plays a very important role, right? What we're going to be doing essentially is we're going to try to create valuable, relevant, and hopefully consistent, meaning always telling the same story, content that is of interest to a very specific and defined audience. In our case, it's going to be our target market, right? That's how we're basically going to try to create the digital assets that we're going to have online. Now, at the end of the day, the reason why we're going to build all this content, other than to get some engagement from our customers, is to obtain some sort of customer action. Action might mean, spend time in our website or use our app, right? Or it could be down the stream, maybe other actions like buy our products, be an active advocate for our brand in maybe social media, right? So there is going to be different actions or action that we're interested in achieving. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to deliver content that is actually relevant and interesting to our customers. But I want to really emphasize that it needs to be consistent with our brand positioning or our brand ethos. Now, how are we going to go about this? Well, creating content is not something that can be left to chance. So we really need to come up with a set of structures, processes, and plans in place that are going to enable us to really do a good job creating this content, right? And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially break this strategy down into three important aspects. The first one is basically substance, right? Which is who are we trying to reach? This boils down again to our target segment or segments if we have multiple. And why are we going to protect our brand in one way or another, right? What kind of values is our brand behind, right? What do we stand for? This is very important. We need to develop strong and clear brand personality, which, by the way, is something that takes a long time and requires incredible consistency and dedication. Okay. Secondly, uh, we need to have some structure behind this, right? Where is our content going to be found? What kind of platforms are we going to be using, right? Are we going to have our own website? Probably yes. And if so, what's going to be there, right? Secondly, what kind of social media platforms are we going to create content for as well? Does it match with the interest of our target audience, right? And also, very importantly, how are we going to organize all this content, right? So that the customer, hopefully is interested in what we have created, can actually easily find it. Finally, because the internet is an evolving being in a way, you need to create content over time. And you need to be, in many ways, planning when this is going to happen. So you need to have some sort of workflow model that it's going to enable you to know when you should be putting out different pieces of content, planning it over time and across, ideally, multiple platforms. So we're going to see a little bit about some of the tools that are used in the field by most companies to basically plan this content over time. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, the reason why we're going to develop this content, like I said, already foreshadowed in the presentation, is because we are trying to develop our brand essence. What is our brand essence? Brand essence is essentially the value or values, if there are a few, but maybe a handful, that your brand stands for. Right? And you need to understand that picking these values is very, very important. And I'm only going to give you two, I think, very important criteria when it comes down to picking your values. I'm assuming you already have this. If you're a well-developed brand that it's been in the market for many years, hopefully you know what your brand stands for. Although in my experience, a lot of brands don't have a very clear idea about what they stand for. So maybe a brand audit will be a good thing to do before any of this content generation. But assuming that you know your values, right? Let me suggest a couple of things that you should consider. One is you cannot stand for many different values. You're going to have to pick. Okay, one, two, maybe three. I'm not even sure you can go this deep, right? It's very hard to convey a very complex story to customers. The story needs to be simple but powerful. And here is where the second part comes, right? When you're choosing your values for your brand, it's particularly important that you stand for a value that your target segment or target segments, if you have more than one, cares about, right? So I don't care what the value is, but it needs to be something that is relevant to your target segment. Okay. So other than that, you can stand for many things, but pick wisely, right? Good. Now, assuming that you have that homework already done, maybe years ago. Now, the way we communicate that value to the customer is going to be oftentimes through messaging, right? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to oftentimes contrast your brand values, what your brand stands for, with the brand values of your competition, right? And what you're doing there is you're trying to position your brand against competitors, right? This is how we're different. Hopefully, this is how we're better, right? Okay. Now, what content marketing is going to enable you to do is essentially to develop that brand essence, right? You know what your values are, but does your customer know, right? And if the answer is no, or maybe they used to know, but they sort of forgot, right? Content is a very, very powerful way of conveying those values to the customer. using maybe tools like storytelling, which we maybe will talk about as we develop. Now, storytelling is particularly important because as humans, we oftentimes have communicated content using storytelling. In fact, if you go further than a couple thousand years, actually, let's be honest, if you go further than about 500 years, the average human didn't know how to read, and there were no books available, right? So almost every piece of conceivable information has passed from human to human through storytelling. This is why stories are so powerful, because we've been using it for probably hundreds of thousands of years to essentially survive. So we're really hardwired for stories. So if you're good at telling stories, people are going to listen. I hear often, and I think this is a well-known fact, that kids don't like reading, and most kids don't read a book. But I have here a book, or maybe if we're honest, a series of books. And yes, I know, movies, that's what you can see right here, that basically capture the imagination of literally hundreds of millions of kids, right? And a lot of kids wouldn't put these books down. And the reason why is because the storytelling is impeccable, and maybe more importantly, because it tells an old archetype that resonates with all humans, right? But powerful stories are extremely powerful. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to leverage a little bit of that power in our content generation so that we can actually convey what our brand stands for. Now, what else do we need to throw in the mix to really complete the picture? Is the idea of personas. We have already discussed this a little bit. But what is a persona? A persona is a tool that you're going to use. It's some sort of theoretical customer that really doesn't exist. And the reason why you create it, maybe out of thin air, hopefully out of some data, and if you don't have hard data, maybe you can do some thinking, trying to put yourself into the shoes of a customer. But a persona is basically an archetypical customer. If you were to pick at random somebody in your target segment, what will be the story that you will tell about this person? That honestly doesn't exist. It's a convolution of the essence of the customer across the entire segment, right? And you can have very different personas for the same product, right? So here I'm going to echo the example provided in the book, which I think is actually a good example. You have a simple product like Philadelphia cream cheese, right? It's a staple, it's a well-known brand. In fact, at least in my country, the brand Philadelphia is actually used instead of cream cheese. People don't talk cream cheese, they say Philadelphia cheese, and everybody knows what that means. And because it's been around for so long, it's such a strong brand in this space, right? But if you're talking about a brand like this, they might have very different customer segments that they are going to be tapping into, they're going to try to target. On one hand, you might have a very sophisticated cook, somebody who spends quite a bit of time cooking. They actually look for recipes online. They watch YouTube videos to make sure that they learn new techniques on how to prepare food, etc., etc. Now, this customer, whether it's a mom or a dad or single, I don't care, right? It's going to have a very different set of needs and interest than a very different persona, which will be somebody that maybe is a busy mom that works part-time and still trying to take care of their two kids as well as she can, like all good moms do, right? And because of that, she's always in a hurry, but she still needs to provide for their kids, and because of that, is going to prepare some sort of sandwich or lunch using different ingredients, like, for example, Philadelphia. Now, those two personas are very different, and if you basically use this tool, it's going to really guide what the motivations, interest, and ideas behind these personas are. And the kind of content that you're going to create online is going to vary widely, right? In the case of the first persona, somebody that is maybe more inclined to the high cuisine, right? The kind of content that you will have to develop will be very different. They are both going to be interested in recipes, maybe, right? But the kind of recipes that are going to resonate with one versus the other are going to be very different. So these personas are going to really strongly guide how that content becomes actual messaging, right? So the persona is basically what's going to enable you to focus some themes that we're going to discuss in the next slide so that you can actually make them concrete and interesting for the target segment that you're trying to capture. Now, how do you go about this? Well, before we can actually talk more about content, let's go at the goal of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to develop our brand. We're trying to make our brand essence clear. We're trying to tell a story about who we are and why customers should listen to us at all, right? For you to do that, you need to have a clear brand identity, right? Who are you? I already discussed this a little bit on the previous slide. And maybe even more importantly, how do customers perceive you at this point? Now, if you're a really small brand or you're a new brand, and for the most part, you start with a blank slate. So if you ask customers, what does a certain brand stand for? Oftentimes, what you're going to get is a blank stare. Right? In fact, for most brands, customers don't know much about you. So what they're going to do usually is they're going to use cues from, for example, the name, or if there is a logo, or if they can see the product, right? And based on that, I'm going to try to answer the question, but they really don't know. On the other hand, if you talk about well-established brands, like I have here Under Armour, for example, right? If you ask people when it comes down to Under Armour, what is the first thing that comes to mind? The answer to that question is essentially brand associations. These are concepts that live in the minds of the customer that can be elicited or can be basically primed whenever you think about the brand. There are different models that explain this, and if you've taken the principles class with me, maybe you've already seen this. But what I want to make sure that you understand is that these brand associations are essentially a reflection of every experience that the customer has had with the brand in the past. That includes owning the product, anything that they've heard from friends or relatives about the product. When I say this, also online reviews, obviously, right? Any commercial that they've seen about the product, any celebrity endorsement, any touch point of the brand is going to basically add a little bit of data to the perception that you have about the brand, and it's going to essentially create this network of brand associations, right? So successful brands usually have at least a few brand associations that are very strong. Every time you think about the brand, that association triggers. And reversely, if you think about the brand association, there is a good likelihood that you will think about the brand, right? So let's pick Under Armour, for example. What does Under Armour stand for? If you ask people about Under Armour, you might get different responses, but some of the responses that you'll hear is, athletics, okay, good. Sports endorsements. Somebody might mention this gentleman over here, The Rock, which you probably know, right? Some people will tell you tough, etc., etc. There is a set of brand associations that come with this brand. Now, what we're trying to do online is maybe we're trying to refine or create some more brand associations. Now, these associations are like intermediate goals in the pursuit of developing a strong brand essence or a strong brand personality, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to tell a story to the customer about what the brand stands for, right? And the way we're going to do this is developing these themes, right? Now, these themes need to be in line with the values that our brand stands for. This is why the values are so important. And I was saying that hopefully you've already picked those, right? So in the case of Under Armour, the value that we're trying to convey is that you're a hard worker, and through hard work, you can achieve excellence, right? These are themes that we are going to develop downstream, and we're going to create content around it. Like, for example, I might show you somebody who is famous, like The Rock, and I'm going to maybe show you, yeah, he's wearing Under Armour clothing, fine. But the interesting thing is, this is not a sales pitch. What I'm showing you is what kind of workouts, for example, he's doing, how early he's getting up in the morning and maybe doing 2 workouts a day, to show you that hard work is actually leading you to results, etc., etc. There is a theme underlying there. That theme should be in line with the brand associations that you're trying to convey, right? And those brand associations should be in accordance to the brand values that you have picked, right? Brand associations are kind of like an intermediate between your values and the messaging that you're going to use, right? So start by developing your brand values, then think about what kind of brand associations you will have if your values will realize, which might take years. And then after that, come up with themes that are going to convey the story of the brand associations to your customers. So for example, if the theme is you can achieve excellence through hard work, and now what this is going to enable you to do is come up with a whole host of different content ideas that are going to fall under this theme umbrella. And of course, this is going to match the value that your brand stands for. Good. Now, let me make a little departure from what's in the chapter, because I think this is important now. Because we need to make choices in this class, I have actually chosen not to cover some chapters. Now, those chapters are very important, but there is a lot of content that overlaps with our Principles of Marketing class that you have already taken. So because of that, some of this, though essential, I have decided to skip. Now, we're going to come to a point where if you don't have a clear grasp on what an objective is and a goal is and a key performance indicator is, and you're going to get in trouble. So to avoid this, I'm going to give you a quick recap of something that we did already cover in our principles class, which is what is an objective. An objective is essentially what you're trying to achieve as a company, right? And so typical objectives would be profits, right? For example, although it's not the only kind, right? And so for example, if you are the Red Cross, it's not about profits, it's about maybe furthering a cause. Okay, good. Now, having said that, everybody understands what an objective is. But objectives tend to be really broad. And to achieve that objective, there is going to be a set of goals that are going to help you get there. So goals essentially are smaller objectives or smaller pieces of the puzzle. Now, objectives and goals need to have specific characteristics to be useful for a planning and strategic use. Now, to do this, everybody tends to use this shorthand, which you have right here, which is SMART objectives. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, and I'm going to skip through some of them because I don't think they are as essential. First, your objective needs to be specific. This is absolutely essential. What do I mean by specific? Let me give you an example. Imagine that you're a new brand. One of the first stages in the customer journey is becoming aware that a brand exists. If you don't know a brand exists, you're not going to be buying the product, most likely, right? So because of that situation, awareness is a very basic objective that you might actually have. Now, saying that you want to increase your awareness in the marketplace is not a good objective. And the reason why it's not is because it's not specific enough. Okay? What do I mean by this? You need to be concrete about how much and how you're going to measure that change in awareness. Making it higher is too vague, right? It needs to be more specific. How can you make it specific? You make it specific by measuring it. What do you mean by measure? Well, in the case of awareness, for example, you might ask some customers or maybe potential customers a question like, please tell me all the brands of sports apparel that you can think of, right? And that will be called unaided awareness. And the reason why it's unaided is because you're not giving a list of brands and asking people to check them once they know. You're asking them to do basically their own retrieval, which may be challenging. Actually, it's quite a bit more challenging than checking from a list, right? Now, having said this, you're going to measure that, right? So if you ask 100 people how many actually mention your name, the percentage in this case, because I conveniently just ask 100, right? Will tell you where you are within the awareness spectrum, where obviously they can go between 0% of the population and 100% of the population, right? So if you want to make it specific, you need to measure it, okay? But not only you need to measure it, but you're actually going to have to tell me how much should it increase, right? If you're telling me that you want to increase awareness, making it specific is telling me, hey, I want to go and increase my awareness by 5 percentage points, okay? Which is a good start, right? Now it's specific, it's measurable, especially if you specify what that metric is going to be, unaided awareness. By the way, there is aided awareness, which you could be using. You could be using both, that's fine. Okay. Next, you need to make sure that that measurement is attainable, right? Is it 5% realistic, right? If your awareness right now is 95%, getting another 5% in awareness, in my experience, is not going to be an attainable metric. Okay, and the reason why is because there is always people that don't know what's going on, right? So no matter how much messaging you do, no matter how much you spend on advertising, it doesn't matter how much marketing effort you put forth, there is always going to be a percentage of the population that is not going to remember you. And because of this, maybe in this case, 5% is not attainable. Whereas in other cases, if you're starting from 0, maybe 5% is attainable. But there is an important question that you need to think about there, which is, hey, how realistic is that we will achieve that? And that's going to be a function of your time span, right? If you tell me that you're going to gain 5% consumer awareness about your brand in a 2-day period, maybe that's not realistic, right? Even though that might be attainable in a longer term, right? Maybe 2 days is too few. And I don't know exactly where that threshold is. Maybe experience will tell you something here, but most people will agree that going from 0 to 5 in 2 days, it's going to be at least very difficult, okay? On the other hand, achieving that over a year period, or maybe 6 months, it depends how good you are in your marketing, might be very achievable, right? Now, there is an important caveat here. Whenever you're coming up with your goals or objectives, it's very important that you make them time-bound. You need to tell yourself, I want my awareness to increase by 5 percentage points. That makes it specific and measurable, especially if you specify the metric, okay? But most importantly, I'm going to achieve those 5 percentage points in 6 months. If you don't specify the time frame, then you're never going to be knowing whether you're doing a good job or not, right? Because it's a blank check to yourself saying that you can achieve that whatever time frame it is. If you're only at 3%, you can always tell me, well, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're still in the right track to achieve that 3 years down the line, right? And by the way, if 3 years is the right time frame for what you're trying to achieve, there's nothing wrong with having mid or long-term goals as well. Okay, these all need to be appropriate for what it is that you're trying to achieve. Good. What are goals? Goals are smaller parts of an objective. Let me give you an example for this. So if you've taken one of my classes, I know some of you have, I've struggled with weight management all my life, right? Getting close to 50, so this is a long race, let's put it like this, or battle. Maybe battle is better than race. So if you're interested in being healthy, let's say, that's maybe a more holistic goal than just looking at your weight, right? That could be an objective that you could have as a person, right? Be healthy, okay? Now, to achieve that objective, there might be other sub-objectives, or maybe better said, goals, that are maybe a smaller portion of what being healthy is. So for example, one of those goals could be eating healthy, okay? Now, being healthy is not only about eating. There are other aspects like exercise, the kind of activities that you do on a regular basis other than exercise and eating. like sleeping, for example, etc., etc. So it's not just about eating, but eating, hopefully we'll agree, plays an important role in being healthy. Okay, so this will be a goal under the umbrella of the objective of being healthy. This is the distinction between goal and objective. They are not that different. In many ways, they are the same, but one tends to be nested in the other. The goal is the smaller portion, let's say, of the objective. So eating well will be one of my goals, and I'm going to have to define that further, right? I'm going to have to make it concrete, right? So in my case, that might mean, for example, having certain percentages of fats, carbs, and protein. Those are the three macronutrients. I'm assuming you know what they are. All food can be broken down into those three categories for the most part. So some micronutrients, things like vitamins, etc., but those are small portions of the intake of food that you have, right? Or maybe what you're trying to do is, instead of balance your macronutrients, maybe what you need to do is eat more vegetables, right? Which may be another sub goal that you have, essentially, right? Or maybe in my case, manage basically your caloric intake. Make sure that you don't eat too much, regardless of whether you're eating carbs, protein, or fat. And no matter how many veggies you eat, if you eat too many calories, you're going to gain weight. And that's going to have repercussions to your health, like high blood pressure in my case, etc., etc. Okay, so those are goals. Then you have how you're going to get to those goals. And then finally, you're going to have KPIs. These are essentially metrics, but the name KPI stands for key performance indicators. Not every metric is a KPI, but every KPI is a metric. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, KPIs are from all the measures that you can use to determine whether you're eating well. The ones that are you consider, for whatever reason, maybe you're looking at empirical evidence, that would be nice. The ones that actually are most important. There might be 17 different metrics that you can use to determine whether you're doing something or not. And out of those 17, you're going to pick the 1, 2, or 3, depends how many resources you're going to deploy here, and that are going to enable you to check whether you're actually doing a good job or not. Okay. So in this case, the KPIs, the metrics could be maybe body fat level, that's percentage typically of fat in your body, okay, which can be measured, for example, with calipers. And the amount of calories in your food, so maybe you have some sort of log that you're keeping, maybe using an app where you're tracking the food intake, and based on that and some database, you're getting basically caloric intake. If you want to do a good job at this, by the way, you might need a scale to measure the weight of the food, otherwise the amount of error might be off. Another metric you might have is the amount of alcohol intake in a given time period, maybe a day or a week, right, etc., etc., etc. Now, not all these metrics are created equal, and I will argue, for example, if you want to eat healthy, probably calories and food intake will be a much better metric than alcohol intake, okay? But they are both indicatives of what eating well means, okay? And then finally, so we are all on the same page, once that you have determined what the important KPIs are, the metrics that you're going to be basically focusing to determine whether you're achieving your goals and objectives or not, you're going to have to set a target, okay? So for example, in my case, I want my body fat to be under 20%, okay? So that means 19 or lower. And if I'm not there, that means that I'm not doing a good job in my weight management, okay? So what I'm doing is I'm setting essentially a line or a standard, and I'm going to call that a target. For each KPI that you have, you need to have at least one standard. In fact, if you ask me, you should only have one standard per KPI, number one. Number two, for each goal, you need at least one KPI. Usually you have more than one, but oftentimes you only have one, okay? Of course, pick the KPI wisely. It needs to actually capture something related to goal, okay? So for example, if as a KPI I use my height when I'm trying to determine whether I eat well or not, yeah, it's going to be very accurate because it's easy to measure height, but it doesn't have to do anything with that objective. So it's really a poor KPI. I'm assuming everybody understands this. And then finally, for each objective, you need at least one goal. Typically, you'll have more, because what you're doing with the goals is you're breaking down that objective into the little aspects or steps that you need to follow before the larger objective can be achieved. Now, this is going to be essential to what we're going to discuss next. So what's up with all these objectives? Well, now that you understand what an objective is and how it relates to goals and KPIs, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about basically why we are creating content. The reason why we're creating content is so that we can achieve our goals. What kind of goals are we discussing? Well, it's going to be obviously marketing goals, because this is a marketing class, right? Now, to achieve those goals, which may be, for example, increasing brand awareness, it might be about, defining some brand value, so improving, for example, our positioning in the marketplace. It might be increasing our revenue, right, or increasing sales, which is the same thing, etc., etc., etc. So you're going to have a certain objective that you're trying to achieve, and the way you're going to help getting there is by creating this match between the content and the objective that you're trying to achieve. What do you mean by this? Well, not every goal is equally driven by all types of content. I'm assuming this is obvious to everybody. But if you have a diagram from the book, I think that's a decent job showing you that depending on what it is that you're trying to do, meaning, am I trying to increase the chances that people will buy, then I will be moving more in this direction. Okay, these are tools that are going to help you with that. Okay, these are type of contents that are going to help you convert somebody from maybe using your app, maybe being in your website, to actually taking products to the cart, and from the cart completing the sale, right? On the other hand, if you have type of content that maybe it's not going to be so well suited, I should say, although some things can work anyway, for closing a sale, but they may be particularly useful if you're trying to develop a new brand. You're trying to get people to become aware that you're around, right? So not all type of content is created equal. Some of that content is going to be particularly useful for certain objectives. And what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to think hard about, given your situation and the objective that you're trying to achieve, what kind of content is going to be better at achieving that objective that you're trying to get. Now, let me say another thing. Oftentimes I focus on concepts, and you might be thinking that most of this refers to essentially typing content in my website, but that's not the case. Okay, there are many other types of content that go beyond text, and in fact, while text was king 20 years ago, images and videos are king now, right? So there are different types of content that you should be seriously considering, and of course, this is going to be a function also of the platform that you use, right? So if you're using social media, which we're going to discuss at length later, the platform is going to dictate to a large degree what kind of content you're going to use. So if you're in Instagram, it's most likely going to be a picture plus some text. If you're in YouTube, more likely going to be a video and maybe some text. If you're in a website setting, you might have many different options of content, from text to videos. You can develop gadgets, like, for example, we're talking about health. One thing that you might consider doing is having some sort of calculator online that lets you determine what should be your caloric intake based on some characteristics, like your height, right? Like your activity level, right? So if you're a sedentary person like me who sits in the office for 10 hours creating content, in this case video content, for your students, well, your caloric intake is going to be very different than if you are, I don't know, somebody who works at the post office in a large city and you actually take envelopes, letters, and boxes door to door, walking an 80-pound bag, or maybe a cart if it's 80 pounds, because otherwise you probably won't make it. So the level of calorie need is going to be very different between those two people, even if they have the same height and the same amount of active muscle, right? So you create a tool for that, and then people like me who are struggling with their weight might actually go there to gather information about what their caloric intake should be on an average day, so that you can do some planning and hopefully get that weight management underway, and maybe successfully managing that weight. And again, if you're trying to provide entertainment to your customers, maybe what you want to do is create a video game, right? And you might think, well, a video game, and the army did this for many years, right? If they were trying to increase the amount of recruitment that they were getting, and how did they basically get young adults being interested in the army? Well, they created a first-person shooter, right? And by getting people to play the game, you can start getting them on the path of getting interested in actually becoming a soldier and maybe serving this country, through the army in this case, right? Good. So the key idea here is match the goal. When I say goal, objective, one is a little bit smaller than the other, but at the end of the day has the same SMART characteristics, to basically what can that content do for you, right? Not all content is created equal, and use the type of content, the vehicle, that is gonna do the best job at trying to achieve that goal. And also, when I'm saying this, obviously take into consideration that maybe the preferences of the customer are going to be different, right? So, for example, you might see that there are certain platforms that tend to be preferred by some customers over others, right? So if your target segment is, for example, a young male, right? In a situation like that, maybe going to Pinterest, it's probably not a good idea, because if you look at the profiling, we'll see this down the line, of the average person in Pinterest, it's going to be typically a female, right? And it's going to be a little bit older demographic. So because of that, maybe given the preferences that the particular demographic that you're interested in reaching has shown over time, you will use different platforms, and associate with those platforms maybe different types of content delivery mechanism.